In the middle of the 12th century, if you had asked any scholar in Baghdad, Constantinople, or Beijing to name the most fearsome military force on earth, not one would have mentioned the scattered tribes dwelling in the windswept steppes north of China. These horse-riding nomads, struggling for survival in what we now call Mongolia, seemed destined for nothing more than endless cycles of petty warfare and seasonal migration. Yet within a single generation, these same barbarians would forge the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. To understand how this transformation occurred, we must first journey to the steppes themselves, a vast, unforgiving landscape that would forge a people capable of conquering half the known world. The great grasslands occupy a harsh realm between worlds, stretching over 600,000 square miles. This elevated plateau sits trapped between the Siberian forests to the north and the Gobi Desert to the south, between the Altai Mountains to the west and the forests of Manchuria to the east. Here, winter temperatures plummet to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, while summer heat can soar past 100 degrees. The growing season lasts barely 4 months, and precipitation is so scarce that only the hardiest grasses can survive. This seemingly barren landscape was home to perhaps 700,000 people during the 12th century, a number that would seem laughably small to the millions living in the great cities of China or the Islamic world. But the steppes had shaped these people into something unique. Every child was born into the saddle, literally. They learned to ride before they could properly walk, and by age 5, they were accompanying their families on hunts, learning to shoot arrows from horseback at full gallop. The nomadic way of life revolved entirely around their animals. Horses provided transportation, milk, and occasionally meat. Sheep and goats supplied wool, meat, and milk for cheese and airag, the fermented mare's milk that was both drink and sustenance. Camels carried the heaviest loads during migrations, while cattle provided leather and additional food. A family's wealth was measured not in land or gold, but in the size of their herds. This nomadic existence demanded constant movement. As seasons changed, entire tribes would pack their felt tents, called gers or yurts, and migrate hundreds of miles to find fresh pasture. These migrations were not random wanderings, but carefully planned movements following ancient routes, with different clans holding traditional rights to specific grazing areas. The logistics of moving thousands of people and animals across vast distances required extraordinary organization and leadership skills that would later prove invaluable in military campaigns. The steppes recognized no central authority. Instead, they were divided among dozens of competing clans, each fiercely protective of their grazing rights, herds, and honor. The tribes we now call Mongols were just one of many Turkic and Mongolic peoples scattered across this vast region. There were the Tatars to the east, the Merkits to the north, the Naimans to the west, and the Karaites in the central regions. Each group spoke slightly different languages, followed different shamanistic traditions, and maintained their own complex web of alliances and blood feuds. Warfare was endemic. Raids between clans were so common they were almost ritualistic, a way of life rather than extraordinary events. Young men proved their worth by stealing horses, capturing women, or avenging perceived slights. These conflicts were rarely about territorial conquest in the traditional sense, since nomads didn't claim permanent ownership of land. Instead, they fought for honor, for livestock, for prestige, and for the right to use the best pastures. The spiritual world of these nomads was dominated by Tengrism, an ancient shamanistic belief system that saw the universe as populated by countless spirits inhabiting every mountain, river, tree, and stone. At the apex of this spiritual hierarchy stood Tengri, the eternal blue sky, source of all power and divine mandate. A ruler who possessed the mandate of heaven from Tengri could claim legitimacy over all peoples under the sky, a concept that would later justify claims to universal empire. Shamans, known as Bu, served as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. They performed rituals to ensure successful hunts, good weather, and protection from evil spirits. They also served as healers, using herbs and spiritual practices to treat illness and injury. Perhaps most importantly, they interpreted omens and dreams, providing guidance for major decisions like when to migrate, whom to ally with, or when to launch raids. This world of endless feuding and migration might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the dramatic changes occurring in the settled civilizations surrounding the steppes. For centuries, the steppes had existed on the periphery of great empires, sometimes raiding them, sometimes serving as mercenaries, but never posing an existential threat. But by the 12th century, this balance was shifting. To the south and east lay the realm of the Jin dynasty, established by the Jurchen people who had conquered northern China in the early 12th century. The Jin controlled a vast territory, from the Great Wall to the Yangtze River, ruling over millions of Chinese subjects and commanding armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Their capital at Zhongdu, modern Beijing, was one of the largest cities in the world, protected by massive walls and seemingly impregnable fortifications. The Jin represented a new type of threat to the steppe peoples. Unlike previous Chinese dynasties, who had been content to build walls and defend against nomadic raids, the Jin actively sought to control and manipulate the tribes. They played different clans against each other, offering titles and tribute to some while waging war against others. This policy of divide and rule had been largely successful, keeping the steppes fragmented and preventing any single tribe from becoming too powerful. But the Jin strategy contained the seeds of its own destruction. By constantly interfering in steppe politics, they had created a generation of tribal leaders who understood Chinese weakness and wealth. More importantly, they had demonstrated that the great settled civilizations were not invincible. They could be defeated by nomadic warriors who understood their military methods and political divisions. The steppes had seen great nomadic empires before. The Xiongnu had terrorized China for centuries, forcing the Han dynasty to build much of what we now call the Great Wall. The Rouran had dominated the grasslands in the 5th and 6th centuries, until they were overthrown by the Gukturks, who in turn created a vast empire stretching from Korea to the Black Sea. Most recently, the Khitan people had established the Liao dynasty, ruling over northern China and much of the steppe region from the early 10th century until the 1220s. Each of these empires had followed a similar pattern. A charismatic leader would unite scattered tribes, launch devastating raids against settled civilizations, extract tribute and wealth, and then watch their empire fragment as their successors fought over the spoils. The Liao dynasty had been the most successful, lasting over 2 centuries, by adopting Chinese administrative methods while maintaining their nomadic military traditions. But even they had eventually fallen to the Jurchen Jin, who proved more adaptable and ruthless. By the middle of the 12th century, the steppes were more fragmented than they had been for generations. The fall of the Liao had created a power vacuum that no single tribe had been able to fill. The Jin dynasty deliberately encouraged this fragmentation, supporting different clans in their conflicts and ensuring that no leader could accumulate enough power to threaten Chinese territory. The Tatars, traditional enemies of the steppe tribes that would become known as the true people of the felt tents, had grown particularly powerful under Jin patronage. They controlled much of the eastern steppes and served as the Jin dynasty's primary agents in managing tribal affairs. The Tatars had been responsible for the death of several prominent tribal leaders, including a young chief named Yesuge, whose son would soon seek revenge. To the west, the Naiman tribe had established a loose confederation under their Taiyang, Prince Inanch Bilge. The Naimans were more sophisticated than most steppe peoples, having adopted writing and many customs from the sedentary populations they ruled. They considered themselves the rightful heirs to the old Turkic empires and looked down on the barbarous tribes to their east as inferior cousins unworthy of respect. In the central steppes, the Karaites under Togrul Khan maintained an uneasy balance between Chinese and steppe influences. Many Karaites had converted to Nestorian Christianity, a fact that would later lead to European legends about Prester John, a Christian king in the east. Togrul had been a blood brother to Yesuge and maintained friendly relations with various clans, but his loyalty was always conditional on political advantage. The Merkits controlled the forests and river valleys to the north, while smaller tribes like the Jadaran, Taichud, and Besud occupied various territories throughout the region. Each group maintained its own traditions, alliances, and grievances, creating a complex web of relationships that changed constantly as fortunes rose and fell. Into this fractured world, around the year 1162, a child would be born who would transform not just the steppes, but the entire course of human history. The world was about to witness the rise of Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the scourge of God, the man who would unite the scattered tribes and launch them on a conquest that would reshape civilization itself. But in 1162, he was just another nomad child, born into a minor clan struggling for survival on the harsh steppes. The great empires of the world continued their ancient routines, unaware that their doom was taking its first breath in a felt tent somewhere in the grasslands north of China. The storm that would devastate kingdoms and topple dynasties was gathering strength. But for now, it was just the wind whistling across the endless steppes, carrying the scent of horses and the promise of change. The child born in that felt tent around 1162 entered the world clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist. An omen, the shamans declared, that he would spill much blood in his lifetime. His father, Yesuge, chief of the Borjigin clan, named him Temujin after a Tatar warrior he had recently captured. It was a name that would echo through history, though few could have imagined that this infant, born into a minor tribe struggling for survival, would one day rule an empire stretching from sunrise to sunset. Yesuge was a capable leader, but commanded only a few thousand followers scattered across the harsh landscape. The Borjigin were neither the strongest nor the wealthiest clan on the steppes, merely one family among many trying to carve out an existence in a world where survival depended on the strength of your sword arm and the loyalty of your followers. Yet Yesuge had ambitions beyond his modest circumstances, and he saw in his eldest son the potential for something greater. The boy's early years unfolded in the traditional pattern of nomadic life. He learned to milk mares before dawn, to read the sky for weather signs, and to distinguish the tracks of different animals in the grass. By age 4, he could stay mounted on a galloping horse, and by 6, he was hunting small game with a bow designed for his child-sized frame. But Temujin's education extended beyond the practical skills of survival. Yesuge taught him the intricate web of tribal politics, the importance of honor and loyalty, and the bitter history of their enemies. particularly the Tatars who had killed many Borjigin warriors over the generations. When the boy reached 9 years old, Yasuge decided it was time to arrange his son's marriage, a crucial alliance that could strengthen the clan's position. They traveled to the territory of the Olkunut, where Yasuge had once found his own wife, Hoilun. There, they met Dei Seichen, who had a daughter named Borte, barely a year older than Yasuge's eldest son. The negotiations were swift and successful. Borte was intelligent, strong-willed, and came from a respectable family. More importantly, the alliance would give the Borjigin access to new grazing lands and additional warriors. Following steppe custom, the young heir was left with his future father-in-law's family to work and learn their ways until the marriage could be consummated years later. For a boy accustomed to his father's authority and protection, this separation was both exciting and terrifying. He threw himself into proving his worth to his new family, working harder than necessary and demonstrating the fierce determination that would define his character. But fate had other plans. On his journey home, Yasuge encountered a group of Tatars who recognized him, despite his attempts to travel incognito. They invited him to share their meal, an invitation that could not be refused without deadly insult. The Tatars, remembering old grievances and seeing an opportunity for revenge, laced Yasuge's food with poison. He managed to reach home before the poison took full effect, but within 3 days, the chief of the Borjigin was dead, gasping out his final words as he urged his followers to bring his son home immediately. A messenger rode hard to the Olkunut territory, carrying news that would shatter the boy's childhood forever. At 10 years old, he found himself thrust into a position he was far too young to handle. The child who had been learning to tend sheep and horses was now expected to lead warriors and make decisions that could determine his people's survival. The reality of steppe politics proved brutally unforgiving. Without Yasuge's strong leadership, the Borjigin Confederation began to fragment almost immediately. Rival chiefs who had submitted to Yasuge's authority now saw no reason to follow a mere child. The Taichiud clan, led by Targutai, had long resented Borjigin dominance and quickly moved to assert their own leadership over the scattered tribes. Hoilun, the boy's mother, fought desperately to hold the confederation together. She rode from camp to camp, invoking her late husband's memory and demanding loyalty to his son. But the steppes recognized only strength, and a widow with young children had little to offer seasoned warriors seeking glory and plunder. One by one, the clans that had followed Yasuge packed their belongings and rode away, taking their herds and their swords to serve other masters. The final blow came when Targutai publicly declared that the Borjigin were no longer fit to lead. In a deliberately humiliating gesture, he ordered Yasuge's family to leave the traditional camping grounds and find their own way in the wilderness. The boys who had expected to inherit his father's position found himself an exile at age 11, responsible for protecting his mother, his younger brothers Kasar, Kajun, and Temujin, his half-brother Belgute, and his sister Temulun. The years that followed tested every fiber of Temujin's character. The family survived by foraging for roots and berries, catching fish in streams, and hunting small game with improvised weapons. They wore clothes made from the pelts of rats and marmots, and often went days without adequate food. Hoilun, once the wife of a chief, now grubbed in the dirt for wild onions and garlic, her hands cracked and bleeding from the harsh work. The boys learned to set snares and hunt birds, while young Temulun helped her mother gather dried dung for fuel. It was during these harsh years that Yasuge's eldest son began to develop the qualities that would later make him a legendary leader. He took responsibility for his family's survival with a maturity far beyond his years, often going without food so his younger siblings could eat. He learned to think strategically about every decision, understanding that a single mistake could mean death for all of them. Most importantly, he began to understand the true nature of power, that it came not from birth or tradition, but from the ability to inspire loyalty and deliver results. The family's isolation was not complete. Occasionally, they encountered other outcasts and refugees from tribal conflicts. Some joined their small band temporarily, drawn by Holand's reputation for wisdom and Temujin's growing reputation for fairness and determination. These early followers would form the core of what would eventually become the most feared army in history. One of the most significant relationships forged during this period was with Jamuka, a young man from the Jadaran clan who was roughly the same age as Yesugei's son. They had known each other since childhood, and their friendship deepened during the years of exile. Following an ancient steppe tradition, they became Anda, blood brothers, exchanging gifts and swearing eternal loyalty to each other. Jamuka was charismatic, well-connected, and came from a more powerful clan than the scattered Borjigin. For the young exile, this friendship offered both emotional support and potential political advantages. The two young men complemented each other perfectly. Jamuka was eloquent and sophisticated, comfortable with the complex protocols of tribal diplomacy. The future Khan was more direct and pragmatic, focused on concrete results rather than elaborate ceremonies. Together, they began to attract followers from various small clans and outcast groups, building a coalition based on personal loyalty rather than traditional tribal affiliations. But their friendship would not last. The fundamental differences in their characters and ambitions created tensions that would eventually explode into open warfare. Jamuka represented the traditional aristocratic approach to leadership, believing that birth and bloodline determined a man's right to rule. His blood brother, shaped by years of poverty and exile, had developed a radically different philosophy. He believed that merit and achievement should determine rank, and that even a man born in a lowly tent could rise to greatness if he proved his worth. The breaking point came during a hunting expedition when the two blood brothers were in their early 20s. According to the secret history, the primary source for these events, a dispute arose over the division of hunting spoils. The disagreement itself was minor, but it revealed deeper conflicts about leadership and decision-making. Jamuka expected automatic deference based on his superior birth and connections. The son of Yesugei refused to submit, insisting that leadership should be earned, not inherited. That night, the young Borjigin made a decision that would change the course of history. Rather than continue in a subordinate role to his blood brother, he quietly gathered his most loyal followers, including his family and several minor chiefs who had grown tired of Jamuka's aristocratic pretensions, and departed under cover of darkness. It was both a betrayal of friendship and a declaration of independence. The boy who had once been an outcast was now ready to challenge the established order of the steppes. Word of the split spread quickly across the grasslands. Tribal leaders were forced to choose sides, and to everyone's surprise, many decided to follow the upstart, rather than the well-connected Jamuka. They were drawn by his promise of a new kind of leadership, one based on merit rather than birth, where even common herders could rise to positions of authority if they proved their loyalty and skill. This appeal to meritocracy was revolutionary in steppe society. For centuries, leadership had been the exclusive province of noble bloodlines, with ordinary warriors having little hope of advancement regardless of their abilities. The young leader offered something different, a system where talent and dedication would be rewarded, where a man's worth would be measured by his actions rather than his ancestry. He began implementing this philosophy immediately. The future conqueror promoted capable warriors regardless of their origins, giving them responsibilities that would have been unthinkable under traditional clan structures. He established clear rules for the distribution of spoils from raids, ensuring that even the lowest-ranking warrior received his fair share. Most importantly, he demanded absolute loyalty in return for these opportunities, creating bonds of obligation that transcended traditional tribal affiliations. As word of these innovations spread, more warriors flocked to his banner. They came from defeated clans, from minor tribes seeking better opportunities, and from the ranks of outcasts and refugees who had been ignored by the traditional power structure. Each new recruit strengthened his position and added to his growing reputation as a leader who could deliver on his promises. But success brought new challenges. The traditional chiefs viewed these innovations as a direct threat to their authority and way of life. If merit could triumph over birth, what would become of the established order that had governed the steppes for centuries? Jamusha, feeling betrayed by his former blood brother's departure and jealous of his growing influence, began organizing a coalition of traditional leaders to crush this dangerous upstart before his ideas could spread further. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine not just the fate of a few rival clans, but the future direction of steppe civilization. The boy who had been born clutching a blood clot, who had survived exile and poverty, who had learned to lead through hardship rather than inheritance, was about to face the greatest test of his young life. The outcome would determine whether the steppes would continue their ancient traditions or embrace a new vision of leadership and conquest that would ultimately reshape the world. The transformation from tribal outcast to supreme ruler would not happen overnight. The young leader who had broken with Jamuka faced years of brutal warfare before he could claim the title that would make him legendary. What followed was a masterclass in strategic thinking, military innovation, and political cunning that would lay the foundation for the largest land empire in human history. The first test came sooner than expected. Jamuka, stung by his blood brother's betrayal and alarmed by the growing defections to his rival's cause, moved quickly to crush this challenge to traditional authority. He assembled a confederation of traditional chiefs, including the powerful Taichud, who had originally exiled Yasuge's family. This alliance commanded thousands of experienced warriors and seemed certain to overwhelm the upstart's modest following. The confrontation took place at Dalan Baljut, a site whose exact location remains lost to history, but whose outcome would echo through the ages. Jamuka's forces vastly outnumbered their opponents, and conventional wisdom suggested the battle would be over quickly. But the future Khan had learned hard lessons during his years of exile, and he understood that victory often belonged not to the largest army, but to the most disciplined and motivated one. Instead of meeting his enemies in a traditional cavalry charge, he deployed his forces using innovative tactics that would become hallmarks of later campaigns. His warriors fought in coordinated units rather than as individual heroes seeking personal glory. They used signals and predetermined maneuvers to maintain formation, even in the chaos of battle. Most importantly, they fought not just for loot or honor, but for a vision of the future that promised them advancement based on merit rather than birth. The battle itself was fierce but inconclusive. Neither side achieved a decisive victory, and both armies withdrew to lick their wounds. But the political implications were enormous. The exile had faced the combined might of the traditional chiefs and survived. Warriors across the steppes began to whisper that perhaps the old ways were not as unshakable as they had believed. More importantly, the engagement revealed the military genius that would soon terrorize half the world. During the fighting, the future conqueror demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to read the flow of battle and adapt his tactics accordingly. He identified weaknesses in enemy formations before his opponents even realized they existed. He coordinated the movements of hundreds of warriors as if they were extensions of his own will. Those who fought alongside him that day would later swear that watching him command was like watching a master musician conduct a deadly symphony. But military skill alone would not be enough to unite the fractured steppes. The young leader understood that lasting power required more than victory in battle. It demanded the creation of institutions and systems that could survive beyond any individual's lifetime. He began implementing organizational changes that would transform not just his own forces, but the entire nature of steppe warfare. The most revolutionary innovation was the decimal system of military organization. Traditional tribal armies were organized around clan loyalties and family relationships, making them inherently unstable when different groups had conflicting interests. The new system divided all warriors into units of 10, 100, and 1,000, with promotions based on demonstrated competence rather than hereditary rank. A common herder who showed tactical brilliance could find himself commanding hundreds of men, while a noble who proved incompetent might find himself reduced to the ranks. This meritocratic approach extended beyond military organization. The emerging confederation began developing sophisticated systems for managing conquered territories, distributing resources, and maintaining communication across vast distances. The famous YAM system, a network of relay stations that would eventually span continents, had its origins in these early experiments with efficient administration. The innovations proved their worth when the Merkits launched a devastating raid against the growing confederation. These northern tribes had their own grievances against Yesugei's lineage, and they saw an opportunity to strike while their enemies were still consolidating power. They swept down from their forest strongholds, captured Borte, the future Khan's wife, and carried her off into captivity, along with substantial herds and many prisoners. The response revealed both the personal character and strategic thinking that would define later campaigns. Rather than launching an immediate, emotionally driven pursuit, the young leader spent weeks carefully preparing his response. He reached out to potential allies, including his former patron Togrul Khan of the Karites, explaining how Merkid aggression threatened the stability of the entire region. He gathered intelligence about enemy positions and planned multiple contingency strategies. Most importantly, he used the crisis to demonstrate his leadership philosophy in action. When the campaign finally began, it showcased military innovations that would later conquer kingdoms. The attacking forces moved with unprecedented speed and coordination, covering vast distances without losing formation. They used diversionary tactics to confuse their enemies about the true direction of attack. They employed sophisticated intelligence networks to track enemy movements and identify vulnerabilities. The Merkids, accustomed to traditional raiding patterns, found themselves completely outmaneuvered by opponents who seemed to anticipate their every move. The rescue of Borte was accomplished with minimal casualties, but the broader campaign had more ambitious goals. Rather than simply recovering stolen property and withdrawing, the Confederation systematically dismantled Merkit power across the northern steppes. Some Merkit clans were absorbed into the growing alliance, Their warriors offered the same opportunities for advancement that had attracted so many other followers. Others were scattered or destroyed, their leaders executed as examples to future enemies. The success against the Merkits established the rising leader's reputation as someone who could deliver on his promises. Warriors who had been hesitant to abandon traditional allegiances now flocked to join an organization that rewarded talent and offered real opportunities for advancement. The Confederation grew from hundreds to thousands, then from thousands to tens of thousands, as word spread about the new kind of leadership emerging on the steppes. But growth brought new challenges. The Tatars, traditional enemies of the Borjigin and longtime allies of the Jin dynasty, viewed the emerging power with alarm. They had been instrumental in eliminating Yesugei and expected his son to remain a minor irritant at best. The transformation of scattered exiles into a formidable military force threatened not just Tatar interests, but the entire balance of power that the Jin had carefully cultivated across the region. The Jin's strategy of divide and rule required that no single steppe leader become powerful enough to threaten Chinese territory. For generations, they had played different tribes against each other, supporting whichever side seemed weaker and ensuring that the nomads remained focused on internal conflicts rather than external expansion. The emergence of a leader who could unite disparate clans under a single banner represented an existential threat to this careful balance. The Tatars moved to eliminate the threat before it could grow further. They assembled their most experienced warriors and launched a coordinated assault designed to crush the upstart confederation before it could fully consolidate its recent gains. This campaign would test not just military innovations, but the fundamental question of whether merit-based leadership could triumph over traditional tribal structures. The ensuing conflict was unlike anything the steppes had seen before. Instead of the ritualized raids and temporary alliances that had characterized previous warfare, this was a struggle for the very soul of nomadic civilization. The Tatars represented everything the old system had to offer: experienced leadership, proven warriors, and the backing of the most powerful empire in the region. Their opponents represented an untested vision of the future, led by a man who had learned his craft through hardship rather than inherited it through birth. The campaign unfolded across multiple fronts, with both sides seeking to gain decisive advantages through alliance building and strategic positioning. The future Khan demonstrated the diplomatic skills that would later prove as important as his military genius, forging agreements with smaller tribes who saw opportunity in backing the challenger rather than supporting the established order. He offered concrete benefits to potential allies, while simultaneously isolating his enemies through a combination of threats and inducements. The decisive engagement came when Tatar forces attempted to surprise their enemies during a seasonal migration. They planned to attack when the Confederation's warriors were scattered across vast distances, protecting herds and families, rather than concentrated for battle. It was a sound strategy that had worked countless times in previous conflicts, but it failed to account for the revolutionary changes in organization and communication that had transformed their opponents. Instead of finding scattered, vulnerable targets, the Tatar raiders encountered coordinated resistance that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The decimal organization system allowed for rapid concentration of forces at threatened points. The communication networks provided early warning of enemy movements. Most importantly, the merit-based command structure ensured that decisions were made by the most competent leaders rather than the most senior by birth. The Tatar defeat was so complete that it effectively ended their existence as an independent power. Their leaders were executed, their warriors absorbed into the growing confederation, and their name became a historical footnote. But the victory's significance extended far beyond the elimination of a single enemy. It demonstrated that the new system could not only survive challenges from traditional powers, but could decisively defeat them. The campaign against the Tatars also revealed the emergence of military leaders who would soon become legendary in their own right. Subutai, still a young man, but already displaying the tactical genius that would make him perhaps the greatest general in history, coordinated complex cavalry maneuvers that left enemies confused and demoralized. Jebe, whose name meant arrow, earned his reputation through feats of marksmanship and scouting that seemed almost supernatural. These men and others, like them, formed the core of what would soon become the most feared military machine on Earth. But even as military victories accumulated, the future conqueror understood that lasting power required more than battlefield success. He began implementing administrative reforms that would allow his confederation to govern conquered territories rather than simply raid them. Chinese advisors and engineers, captured during border conflicts or attracted by opportunities for advancement, introduced new technologies and organizational methods. The synthesis of nomadic military traditions with settled administrative practices created something entirely new, a system capable of both conquest and governance on an unprecedented scale. The transformation was becoming apparent to observers across the region. Diplomatic missions from various kingdoms began arriving at the Confederation's camps, seeking to understand and potentially ally with this emerging power. Trade routes that had been disrupted by constant raiding began operating more efficiently under the protection of forces that guaranteed safe passage in exchange for reasonable tribute. The chaos that had characterized the steppes for generations was giving way to a new kind of order. Yet the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The Confederation had proven itself against traditional tribal enemies. But the real test would come when it faced the organized armies and sophisticated fortifications of settled civilizations. The Jin dynasty, alarmed by reports of unification among their northern neighbors, began preparing for what seemed an inevitable confrontation. The stage was set for conflicts that would determine whether the innovations pioneered on the steppes could succeed against the military traditions of the world's most advanced civilizations. The young leader, who had once been an exile, was now poised to challenge empires. The organizational systems he had created were about to face their ultimate test. The warriors who had followed him from obscurity were preparing to assault walls that had never fallen to nomadic attacks. The world was about to discover whether the transformation that had begun in the felt tents of the steppes could reshape the destiny of kingdoms and dynasties that had endured for centuries. By 1206, the scattered tribes of the steppes had been forged into a unified force under a single banner. In a great assembly called a Kurultai, the assembled chiefs proclaimed their leader, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The boy who had clutched a blood clot at birth, who had survived exile and poverty, who had learned to lead through merit rather than inheritance, now commanded the loyalty of virtually every warrior between the Altai Mountains and the forests of Manchuria. But this was only the beginning. The true test of his revolutionary system would come when it faced the armies and fortifications of the world's great civilizations. The death of the great Khan in 1227 created the first succession crisis in the young empire's history. Following steppe tradition, a Kurultai was convened to select the new leader from among Genghis Khan's sons. The choice fell upon Ogedei, the third son, whose combination of administrative skill and diplomatic temperament made him seem best suited to govern an empire that had grown far beyond its nomadic origins. Ogedei's selection was not accidental. Unlike his older brother, Yoshi, whose legitimacy was questioned due to circumstances surrounding his birth, or Chagatai, whose rigid adherence to traditional law made him unsuitable for governing diverse populations. Ogedei possessed the flexibility and vision necessary to transform a confederation of tribes into a true empire. He understood that conquest was only the first step. Lasting power required the creation of institutions that could administer vast territories and diverse peoples. The new Great Khan inherited more than just military might. His father had begun the process of transforming nomadic raiders into imperial administrators, but this work was far from complete. Chinese engineers and bureaucrats had been incorporated into the growing confederation, bringing with them sophisticated techniques for siege warfare, urban planning, and territorial governance. Persian and Central Asian merchants had established trade networks that linked the steppes to markets across Eurasia. The challenge now was to synthesize these diverse elements into a coherent system of imperial rule. One of Ogedei's first priorities was the completion of his father's unfinished campaigns. The Jin dynasty still controlled much of northern China, despite suffering devastating defeats in earlier conflicts. Their capital at Zhongdu had fallen, but significant Jin forces remained in the field, and their southern territories were still largely intact. The systematic destruction of this ancient enemy would demonstrate the new regime's commitment to finishing what had been started. The final campaigns against the Jin revealed how much the nomadic military machine had evolved since its early days on the steppes. Chinese siege engineers, now serving their former enemies' conquerors, deployed advanced artillery and undermining techniques against fortifications they had once defended. Intelligence networks that spanned continents provided detailed information about enemy troop movements and strategic plans. Most remarkably, the attacking forces demonstrated unprecedented discipline in maintaining supply lines and coordinating operations across vast distances. The fall of Kaifeng in 1233 marked the effective end of the Jin dynasty, though scattered resistance continued for several more years. The campaign's success owed as much to administrative innovation as to military prowess. The attackers had learned to govern conquered territories rather than simply plunder them, incorporating local officials and maintaining existing systems where they proved effective. This approach would become a hallmark of imperial expansion, allowing rapid assimilation of new territories without the massive administrative overhead that had crippled previous nomadic empires. But even as these campaigns unfolded in the east, Ogedei was planning operations on an entirely different scale. The western frontiers of his domain bordered lands that few steppe dwellers had ever seen. The forests of Russia, the plains of Eastern Europe, and beyond them, kingdoms whose very existence was more legend than reality to most nomadic warriors. The prospect of conquest in these distant lands offered opportunities for wealth and glory that dwarfed anything the steppes had previously known. The architect of Western expansion was Subutai, now recognized as the most brilliant military strategist of his generation. His tactical innovations had been crucial to earlier victories, but the campaigns he was about to launch would demonstrate strategic thinking on a scale that few commanders in history have matched. He understood that success in Europe would require not just military conquest, but the creation of entirely new logistical and communication systems to support operations thousands of miles from the empire's heartland. The invasion began with characteristic efficiency and speed. Russian principalities, accustomed to fighting each other in small-scale conflicts, found themselves facing coordinated attacks by forces that seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The traditional European heavy cavalry, effective against similarly equipped opponents, proved helpless against nomadic archers who could strike from long range and retreat before any counterattack could be mounted. The fall of Kiev in 1240 sent shockwaves throughout European Christendom. This ancient city, considered the mother of Russian civilization, had been thought impregnable behind its massive walls and natural defenses. Its destruction demonstrated that no fortress, no matter how strong, could withstand the new forms of warfare that the Eastern invaders had perfected. The psychological impact was as devastating as the military consequences. If Kiev could fall, no city in Europe was safe. The campaigns that followed revealed the true scope of what had been unleashed upon the world. Coordinated forces struck simultaneously at Poland and Hungary, preventing these kingdoms from coordinating their defenses or coming to each other's aid. At Mohi and Legnica, European armies that had never known defeat found themselves not just beaten, but virtually annihilated by opponents whose tactics they could barely comprehend. What made these victories particularly remarkable was not just their scope, but the administrative sophistication that supported them. Forces operating hundreds of miles apart maintained communication through relay systems that delivered messages faster than any European courier network. Supply trains followed predetermined routes that had been scouted months in advance. Local populations were systematically catalogued and organized to provide the resources necessary for continued operations. The death of Ogurde in 1241 came at the moment when European resistance was on the verge of complete collapse. Advanced forces had reached the outskirts of Vienna, and reconnaissance units were already probing the defenses of Western European kingdoms. The sudden halt of operations, as commanders returned east to participate in the succession process, probably saved European civilization from transformation beyond recognition. The succession that followed demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the imperial system that had been created. The Kurultai process ensured that leadership transitions occurred without civil war, but it also created lengthy interregnums during which expansion halted and administrative attention focused inward. Torigen, Ogurde's widow, served as regent for several years, while political negotiations determined the next great Khan, a period that allowed conquered territories to consolidate while expansion plans were suspended. When Mongol finally emerged as the new Great Khan in 1251, he inherited an empire that had grown beyond anything his grandfather could have imagined. From the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Western Europe, from the Siberian forests to the edges of the Indian subcontinent, a single political entity now governed territories and peoples that had never before been united under common rule. The challenge was no longer conquest, but the far more complex task of creating lasting institutions that could govern this unprecedented domain. Mongol brought to this challenge the systematic approach that had characterized his family's rise to power. He initiated the first empire-wide census, a massive undertaking that required the development of new administrative techniques and the training of thousands of officials. This project was more than just an exercise in bureaucracy. It was an attempt to understand and organize the human and material resources of the largest political entity in history. The census revealed the true scope of what had been accomplished. The empire now controlled populations that numbered in the tens of millions, speaking hundreds of languages and following dozens of different religious traditions. It commanded resources that ranged from the furs of Siberian forests to the spices of Central Asian oases, from the manufactured goods of Chinese workshops to the precious metals of Persian mines. The logistical challenge of coordinating these diverse elements into a coherent whole would have overwhelmed any previous administrative system. The solution lay in the synthesis of nomadic flexibility with settled administrative traditions that had begun under Genghis Khan and continued under his successors. The empire adopted and adapted the best practices from each conquered civilization, creating hybrid institutions that combined the efficiency of nomadic decision-making with the sophistication of Chinese bureaucracy and Persian scholarship. This approach produced innovations in governance that would influence political development across Eurasia for centuries. One of the most significant developments was the evolution of the YAM system into a true transcontinental communication network. What had begun as a simple relay system for military messages had grown into a sophisticated infrastructure that connected administrative centers from Beijing to Kiev. Merchants, diplomats, scholars, and officials could now travel safely and efficiently across vast distances that had previously taken months or years to traverse. This communication revolution had profound cultural as well as political implications. Ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions that had been confined to specific regions began spreading across the entire continental landmass. Chinese printing techniques reached European workshops. Islamic astronomical knowledge influenced Chinese scholars, and European metallurgical innovations found their way to Asian craftsmen. The empire had become not just a political entity, but a mechanism for the exchange and synthesis of human knowledge on an unprecedented scale. The expansion into the Middle East under Hulagu revealed another dimension of imperial adaptation. The conquest of Baghdad in 1258 eliminated the Abbasid Caliphate, ending nearly 6 centuries of Islamic political unity centered on that ancient city. But rather than simply destroying existing institutions, the conquerors demonstrated the same pragmatic approach that had characterized their governance elsewhere. Islamic scholars and administrators were incorporated into the new system, and many aspects of Islamic law and custom were preserved where they proved compatible with imperial needs. The establishment of the Ilkhanate in Persia created what was essentially a laboratory for imperial governance in a settled urban environment. The challenges were immense: governing sophisticated urban populations, maintaining complex irrigation systems, managing long-distance trade networks, and balancing the demands of nomadic military elites with the needs of agricultural and commercial populations. The solutions developed in this environment would influence imperial administration throughout the empire's territories. The conquest of the assassins at Alamut represented one of the most psychologically significant victories of this period. For over a century, the Nizari Ismailis had terrorized the Islamic world from their mountain fortresses, using targeted assassination to eliminate enemies and maintain their independence against vastly superior forces. Their leader, known as the Old Man of the Mountain, commanded fanatical loyalty from followers who were willing to die for their cause. European crusaders had learned to fear these shadowy killers, whose very name would enter Western languages as the word assassin. Hulagu's systematic dismantling of the assassin strongholds demonstrated the empire's ability to overcome even the most unconventional enemies. The nomadic forces proved capable of mountain warfare, siege techniques, and the patient, methodical approach necessary to root out defenders from seemingly impregnable positions. More importantly, the campaign showed that no enemy, regardless of their reputation for invincibility, could withstand the coordinated application of imperial resources and expertise. The administrative genius of Yeluchutsai became particularly evident during this period of rapid expansion. This Khitan nobleman, whose people had once ruled northern China under the Liao dynasty, possessed an almost unique understanding of both nomadic and settled administrative traditions. His synthesis of Chinese bureaucratic methods with steppe leadership practices created hybrid institutions that could function effectively across the empire's diverse territories. Chucai's most significant innovation was the development of a standardized taxation system that could be applied to vastly different economic structures. Nomadic herders, Chinese farmers, Persian merchants, and Russian fur trappers all contributed to imperial revenues through methods tailored to their particular circumstances, yet coordinated through a central administrative framework. This system generated unprecedented wealth while avoiding the economic disruption that had characterized previous nomadic conquests. The empire's approach to religious and cultural diversity represented another revolutionary development. Unlike previous conquerors who had typically imposed their own beliefs and customs on subject populations, the imperial administration actively encouraged the preservation and interaction of different traditions. Nestorian Christians, Buddhist monks, Islamic scholars, and Confucian officials all found places within the imperial hierarchy, creating a cosmopolitan environment that fostered intellectual and cultural exchange. This religious tolerance was not merely pragmatic, though it certainly served practical purposes. It reflected a sophisticated understanding that the empire's strength lay not in uniformity, but in its ability to harness the diverse talents and knowledge of all its subjects. Chinese engineers worked alongside Persian astronomers, Arab mathematicians collaborated with European craftsmen, and Indian physicians shared knowledge with Siberian shamans. The result was an explosion of innovation and discovery that accelerated human progress across multiple fields. The evolution of the Yam system during this period transformed global communication in ways that would not be matched until the development of modern transportation networks. The system now included not just relay stations for mounted messengers, but also facilities for the movement of goods, diplomatic missions, and scholarly exchanges. A merchant in Kiev could send orders to suppliers in Beijing with reasonable confidence that his message would arrive within a few months. A scholar in Baghdad could correspond with colleagues in Karakorum, sharing discoveries and debating ideas across vast distances. The economic implications of this communication revolution were enormous. Trade routes that had operated sporadically and dangerously for centuries became reliable commercial highways. The famous Silk Road experienced its greatest period of prosperity under imperial protection, with caravans moving safely from the Mediterranean to the Pacific under the guarantee of imperial safe passage. New trade routes opened across previously impassable regions, linking markets that had never before been connected. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency across the empire further facilitated this commercial revolution. A merchant no longer needed to navigate dozens of different monetary systems or constantly recalculate measurements when crossing political boundaries. Imperial currency was accepted from Hungary to Korea, and imperial standards ensured that goods could be accurately valued and exchanged regardless of their origin. This economic integration created the world's first truly global marketplace, with effects that would influence commercial development for centuries. The empire's military innovations during this period extended far beyond the traditional strengths of nomadic cavalry. The systematic incorporation of siege engineers from conquered territories created a hybrid military machine capable of both rapid movement across open terrain and sustained operations against fortified positions. Chinese gunpowder technology, Persian metallurgy, and European engineering techniques were combined to create artillery and siege equipment that rendered traditional fortifications obsolete. The development of naval capabilities represented an entirely new direction for a power that had originated on the grasslands. The conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China brought with it a sophisticated naval tradition and extensive shipbuilding facilities. Imperial forces learned to operate river fleets, coastal squadrons, and eventually ocean-going expeditions. The failed invasions of Japan, while ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated the empire's willingness to master entirely new forms of warfare in pursuit of its strategic objectives. Intelligence gathering and espionage networks reached levels of sophistication that would not be matched by European powers for centuries. The empire maintained detailed information about the military capabilities, political situations, and economic resources of kingdoms far beyond its borders. Diplomatic missions often served as cover for intelligence operations, while merchant networks provided continuous updates on political and economic developments across Eurasia. The integration of conquered populations into imperial military forces represented another significant innovation. Unlike previous nomadic confederations that had relied primarily on tribal warriors, the mature empire actively recruited and trained soldiers from all its territories. Chinese infantry, Persian cavalry, Russian archers, and European engineers all served under imperial banners, creating truly international armies that combined the best military traditions from across the known world. The role of women in imperial administration during this period deserves particular attention. Sorkak Tani, the wife of Tolui and mother of both Mongol and Kublai Khan, wielded enormous influence behind the scenes, coordinating political alliances and managing vast territories during the succession crises that followed Ogeday's death. Her Nestorian Christian faith and sophisticated education allowed her to serve as a bridge between different cultural communities within the empire. Temujin's regency demonstrated that women could effectively govern at the highest levels of imperial administration. During her rule, she maintained stability across vast territories, managed complex diplomatic relationships with foreign powers, and oversaw the continued expansion of imperial influence. Her success paved the way for other women to assume positions of authority throughout the imperial hierarchy, creating opportunities for female leadership that were unprecedented in most contemporary societies. The empire's approach to urban planning and infrastructure development transformed cities across Eurasia. Karakoram, the imperial capital, became a cosmopolitan center that housed representatives from every major civilization. The city's markets featured goods from across the known world. Its workshops combined techniques from different traditions, and its population included speakers of dozens of languages. Similar transformations occurred in other major cities, as imperial investment and international connections stimulated unprecedented growth and development. The preservation and transmission of knowledge represented one of the empire's most lasting contributions to human civilization. Imperial libraries collected manuscripts in every available language, creating repositories of human knowledge that dwarfed anything previously assembled. Scholars were actively recruited from conquered territories and encouraged to continue their research under imperial patronage. Translation projects made texts available in multiple languages, facilitating the exchange of ideas across cultural and linguistic boundaries. By the middle of the 13th century, what had begun as a confederation of nomadic tribes had evolved into something entirely new in world history. The empire was neither purely nomadic nor purely settled, neither purely military nor purely administrative. It was a hybrid entity that combined elements from every major civilization it had encountered, creating institutions and practices that were uniquely suited to governing the diverse populations and territories it had assembled. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the emergence of the four great Khanates that would define the empire's mature period: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Each developed distinctive characteristics suited to their particular territories and populations, while maintaining connection to the broader imperial system through family ties, diplomatic relations, and shared administrative practices. This division represented both the culmination of imperial expansion and the beginning of its transformation into something even more complex. The empire had grown beyond the point where it could be effectively governed as a single unit, but the connections between its components remained strong enough to maintain coordination and cooperation on matters of mutual interest. The result was a unique form of political organization that combined the advantages of local autonomy with the benefits of participation in a larger system. The achievements of this period would have been impressive by any standard, but they were particularly remarkable given the speed with which they had been accomplished. In less than half a century, a group of nomadic tribes had created administrative systems, communication networks, and governmental institutions that rivaled those of civilizations that had been developing for thousands of years. The transformation demonstrated not just the military capabilities that had made conquest possible, but the intellectual and organizational flexibility that made lasting governance achievable. Yet even as these remarkable achievements were being consolidated, new challenges were emerging that would test the empire's continued evolution. The sheer scale of the territories under imperial control created administrative burdens that strained even the most sophisticated governmental systems. Cultural and religious differences that had been manageable when conquest was the primary focus became more problematic as the emphasis shifted toward long-term governance. The very success of imperial expansion was creating conditions that would ultimately require new forms of political organization and administrative innovation. The empire that emerged from the succession struggles of the 1250s faced challenges that would have overwhelmed any previous political entity in human history. When Kublai Khan declared himself Great Khan in 1260, he was claiming authority over territories that spanned from Korea to Hungary, encompassing perhaps a quarter of the world's population and virtually every major civilization then in existence. But his claim was immediately contested by his younger brother, Arik Böke, setting the stage for a civil war that would fundamentally alter the nature of imperial power. The conflict between Kublai and Arik Böke represented more than just a dynastic dispute. It was a struggle between two radically different visions of what the empire should become. Arik Böke embodied the traditional nomadic values that had created the empire, commanding the loyalty of conservative elements who believed that the steppes should remain the center of imperial power. He controlled Karakorum, the traditional capital, and enjoyed support from those who feared that too much adaptation to settled ways would corrupt the military virtues that had made conquest possible. Kublai, by contrast, represented the future of imperial governance. He understood that ruling vast settled populations required more than nomadic military traditions. It demanded sophisticated administrative systems, economic policies, and cultural institutions that could integrate diverse territories into a coherent whole. His base of power lay in northern China, where he had spent years learning the complexities of governing advanced agricultural and urban societies. The civil war that followed was fought as much with economics and administration as with armies. Kublai's control of Chinese resources, agricultural surplus, manufacturing capacity, and commercial networks gave him enormous advantages in sustaining long-term operations. He could finance large armies, maintain extensive supply lines, and offer concrete benefits to potential supporters. Arik Böke, despite his initial military successes, found himself unable to compete with the economic resources that his brother could deploy. The decisive factor proved to be Kublai's superior understanding of imperial logistics. While Arik Boka relied on traditional nomadic raiding to support his forces, Kublai had developed systematic methods for provisioning armies across vast distances. Chinese agricultural techniques provided reliable food supplies, while manufacturing centers produced the weapons, equipment, and other materials necessary for sustained military operations. The contrast between these approaches became increasingly apparent as the conflict dragged on. By 1264, Arik Boka's position had become untenable. His supporters began defecting to Kublai, attracted by promises of positions in the expanding imperial administration. The traditional nomadic economy proved incapable of supporting the kind of prolonged military effort that the civil war required. When Arik Boka finally surrendered, it marked not just the end of a succession dispute, but the triumph of a new model of imperial governance that would define the empire's remaining century. Kublai's victory shifted the empire's center of gravity permanently southward and eastward. While his grandfather had ruled from the steppes, Kublai established his primary residence in China, first at Chengdu, the Xanadu of European imagination, and later at a magnificent new capital he built where Beijing stands today. This geographic shift reflected a fundamental change in imperial priorities, from conquest and expansion to consolidation and governance. The completion of the conquest of the Song dynasty represented the culmination of generations of imperial ambition. The Song had survived longer than any other major power confronted by nomadic expansion, largely because their southern territories were protected by natural barriers, and their sophisticated military technology made them formidable opponents. But they also possessed the most advanced economy in the world, with manufacturing techniques, commercial networks, and agricultural productivity that dwarfed anything available elsewhere. The final campaigns against the Song revealed how completely the imperial military machine had evolved beyond its nomadic origins. Naval warfare, previously unknown to steppe peoples, became crucial as imperial forces learned to operate river fleets and coastal squadrons. Chinese engineers developed new siege techniques specifically designed to overcome Song fortifications, while imperial administrators implemented systematic policies for governing conquered territories without disrupting their economic productivity. The fall of Hangzhou in 1276 marked the end of the last independent Chinese dynasty for nearly 4 centuries. But more significantly, it brought under imperial control the most sophisticated economy and administrative system in the world. Song China possessed manufacturing capabilities that could produce goods for markets across Eurasia, agricultural techniques that supported population densities unmatched elsewhere, and commercial networks that linked rural producers with urban consumers across vast regions. The establishment of the Yuan dynasty represented an unprecedented experiment in cross-cultural governance. Kublai proclaimed himself Emperor of China, while maintaining his position as Great Khan of the broader empire, creating a dual identity that reflected the complex realities of ruling both nomadic and settled populations. The new dynasty combined elements of Chinese imperial tradition with innovations derived from nomadic administrative practices, producing hybrid institutions that were uniquely suited to governing diverse populations. The failure of the invasions of Japan provided crucial lessons about the limits of imperial power. The campaigns of 1274 and 1281 represented massive investments of resources and demonstrated the empire's ability to project force across oceanic distances. The construction of invasion fleets required sophisticated shipbuilding capabilities, while the coordination of multinational armies showcased administrative skills that few powers could match. Yet both invasions ultimately failed, victim to storms that the Japanese called kamikaze. divine winds that protected their islands from foreign conquest. These failures were instructive precisely because they revealed the boundaries of what even the most powerful empire could accomplish. The typhoons that destroyed the invasion fleets were natural phenomena beyond human control, but they also highlighted the enormous logistical challenges of conducting overseas operations with 13th century technology. The empire could dominate continental land masses, but oceanic expansion required capabilities that would not be available for several more centuries. The campaigns in Southeast Asia produced similarly mixed results, though for different reasons. Vietnam, Burma, and Java all experienced imperial invasions, but none were fully integrated into the empire, despite significant military efforts. These territories possessed difficult terrain, tropical diseases that devastated northern armies, and populations with long traditions of resistance to foreign conquest. The empire learned that some regions were simply too costly to conquer and govern effectively, leading to a more selective approach to expansion. Kublai's court became the most cosmopolitan center in the medieval world, attracting visitors, scholars, and merchants from every known civilization. The famous journey of Marco Polo, while perhaps the best documented, was merely one example of the international exchanges that characterized this period. Persian administrators, Arab scholars, European craftsmen, and Indian physicians all found places within the imperial hierarchy, creating an environment of unprecedented cultural diversity and intellectual exchange. The development of Khan Balik as a planned capital demonstrated the empire's commitment to creating institutions capable of governing a sedentary empire. The city's design incorporated elements from Chinese urban planning traditions while accommodating the nomadic preferences of the imperial elite. Vast parks and hunting grounds satisfied the recreational needs of rulers who still thought of themselves as descendants of steppe warriors, while sophisticated administrative quarters housed the bureaucracies necessary for governing territories from Korea to the Persian Gulf. The economic policies implemented during Kublai's reign revealed a sophisticated understanding of how to integrate nomadic and settled economic systems. The empire maintained the traditional nomadic emphasis on pastoral production, while also promoting agricultural development, manufacturing, and long-distance trade. Chinese agricultural techniques were adapted to nomadic territories, while nomadic organizational methods improved the efficiency of agricultural operations in settled regions. The introduction of paper money represented one of the most innovative features of imperial economic policy. While paper currency had existed in China for centuries, the empire extended its use across much larger territories and backed it with the resources of multiple economies. Imperial paper money was accepted from Hungary to Korea, facilitating trade and economic integration on a scale that would not be matched until the development of modern international monetary systems. The religious policies of Kublai's court reflected the empire's commitment to cultural tolerance and integration. Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Christianity, and Islam all received imperial patronage, while traditional shamanic practices continued to influence court rituals and decision-making. This religious pluralism was not merely pragmatic, it reflected a sophisticated understanding that the empire's strength lay in its ability to harness the diverse talents and knowledge of all its subjects. The scholarly achievements of this period were remarkable by any standard. Imperial patronage supported the compilation of historical records, the translation of texts between different languages, and the development of new technologies that combined knowledge from multiple traditions. Chinese printing techniques were used to reproduce Islamic astronomical texts, while Persian mathematical knowledge influenced Chinese engineering projects. The result was an acceleration of human knowledge that would influence development across Eurasia for centuries. The empire's approach to legal systems demonstrated similar innovation and flexibility. Rather than imposing a single legal code across all territories, imperial administrators developed hybrid systems that incorporated elements from different legal traditions. Chinese administrative law, Islamic commercial regulations, and traditional steppe justice all contributed to legal frameworks that were tailored to specific regional circumstances while maintaining overall coherence. The development of educational institutions under imperial patronage created new opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth. Chinese-style examination systems were adapted to select officials from diverse backgrounds, while traditional nomadic leadership selection methods continued to operate alongside these new bureaucratic procedures. The result was an administrative class that combined the best features of different governance traditions. The empire's military during this period evolved into something completely different from the nomadic cavalry forces that had created it. While traditional mounted archers remained important, imperial armies now included Chinese infantry, Muslim siege engineers, European artillery specialists, and naval forces from maritime traditions. This military integration reflected the broader cultural synthesis that characterized the mature empire. The establishment of the Yuan legal code represented an attempt to create a unified legal framework that could operate across the empire's diverse territories. This code incorporated elements from Chinese, Islamic, and traditional nomadic legal systems, while also introducing new principles designed specifically for governing multicultural populations. The result was a legal system that was both more comprehensive and more flexible than anything previously developed. The economic integration achieved during this period created the world's first truly global marketplace. Goods produced in one corner of the empire could be sold in markets thousands of miles away, while standardized currencies and measurement systems facilitated trade across previously incompatible economic zones. The empire's protection of trade routes and merchants created conditions for commercial expansion that would not be matched until the modern era. Yet even as these remarkable achievements were being consolidated, structural problems were emerging that would ultimately prove fatal to imperial unity. The empire had grown beyond the point where it could be effectively governed as a single entity, despite the sophisticated administrative systems that had been developed. Communication delays across continental distances made coordinated policy implementation increasingly difficult, while cultural and economic differences between regions created tensions that central authority could not easily resolve. The succession problems that would follow Kublai's death were already becoming apparent during his lifetime. The empire's success had created a ruling class with interests that were increasingly divergent from those of the imperial center. Regional administrators developed loyalties to their territories that sometimes conflicted with broader imperial objectives, while the various khanates began pursuing independent policies that reflected their particular circumstances rather than empire-wide strategic considerations. The financial costs of maintaining the imperial system were becoming increasingly burdensome. The elaborate court, massive bureaucracy, and extensive military forces required enormous resources that strained even the empire's vast economic base. The failed invasions of Japan and Southeast Asia had consumed resources without producing compensating benefits, while the costs of maintaining unity across such vast territories continued to escalate. By the 1390s, it was becoming clear that the empire faced fundamental challenges that could not be resolved through administrative innovation alone. The very success of imperial expansion had created conditions that made continued unity increasingly difficult to maintain. The stage was set for the fragmentation that would characterize the empire's final century. Though few contemporary observers could have predicted the speed with which imperial unity would collapse after Kublai's death in 1294. The death of Kublai Khan in 1294 marked the beginning of the end for the unified empire that had dominated Eurasia for nearly a century. Within decades, the vast territories that had been held together by the force of imperial will and the efficiency of nomadic administration would fragment into competing kingdoms, each pursuing its own interests and gradually losing the characteristics that had made the original conquest possible. The succession crisis that followed Kublai's death revealed how completely the empire had been transformed by its own success. The traditional Kurultai system, which had once unified the steppes under a single leader, proved inadequate for selecting rulers capable of governing the complex, multicultural entity that the empire had become. Regional interests had grown stronger than imperial loyalty, and the various khanates increasingly viewed themselves as independent powers rather than components of a larger whole. In China, Kublai's successors faced challenges that would have overwhelmed even the most capable administrators. The Yuan dynasty had never fully integrated with Chinese society, remaining essentially a foreign occupation government that ruled through a combination of military force and administrative efficiency. Chinese intellectuals and traditional elites had been excluded from many positions of authority, creating a reservoir of resentment that would eventually fuel massive rebellions. The economic policies that had sustained imperial expansion began generating serious problems as the focus shifted from conquest to governance. The paper money system, initially a brilliant innovation that had facilitated trade across vast distances, became unstable as regional authorities began issuing currency without adequate backing. Inflation undermined confidence in imperial financial management, while the costs of maintaining the elaborate court and bureaucracy grew beyond the government's ability to pay. Natural disasters during the early 14th century exposed the fragility of the administrative systems that had seemed so impressive during the empire's peak. Floods, droughts, and famines that would have been manageable problems for previous Chinese dynasties became catastrophic because the Yuan government lacked the deep roots in local society that effective disaster response required. The regime's foreign character made it difficult to mobilize the voluntary cooperation that disaster relief demanded. The emergence of the Red Turban Rebellion in the 1350s demonstrated how completely Chinese society had rejected its nomadic rulers. Led by Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant who would eventually found the Ming dynasty, the rebellion combined traditional Chinese religious beliefs with nationalist resentment against foreign rule. The rebels portrayed themselves as liberators, restoring legitimate Chinese governance after generations of barbarian occupation. The military capabilities that had once made imperial forces invincible had atrophied through decades of garrison duty and palace intrigue. The descendants of the warriors who had conquered half the world had become court officials, more concerned with bureaucratic advancement than military effectiveness. Chinese troops serving the Yuan had little loyalty to their foreign masters, while the nomadic components of imperial armies had lost the mobility and tactical flexibility that had been their greatest strengths. The fall of Beijing in 1368 and the establishment of the Ming dynasty marked the effective end of nomadic rule in China. Zhu Yuanzhang, now the Hongwu emperor, systematically dismantled the institutions that had sustained Yuan authority. Foreign administrators were expelled or executed, nomadic military units were disbanded, and Chinese cultural traditions were aggressively promoted as alternatives to the cosmopolitan synthesis that had characterized the imperial period. The retreat of Yuan forces to the steppes represented more than just a military defeat. It was a repudiation of the entire imperial project. The dream of uniting nomadic and settled civilizations under a single government had failed, victim to cultural tensions that no amount of administrative innovation could resolve. The remnant Yuan state that survived in the steppes would endure for several more centuries, but it was a shadow of the empire that had once ruled from Korea to Hungary. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate faced different but equally serious challenges. The region's position at the center of transcontinental trade routes had made it wealthy during the height of imperial unity, but the fragmentation of the empire disrupted these commercial networks. Merchants could no longer count on safe passage across the vast territories that had once been governed by a single authority, leading to the decline of the overland routes that had sustained Central Asian prosperity. Religious divisions that had been manageable during the period of imperial tolerance became sources of serious conflict as central authority weakened. The conversion of significant portions of the Chagatai elite to Islam created tensions with populations that maintained traditional beliefs or followed other religions. These religious conflicts were complicated by tribal rivalries and competing claims to political authority, creating a volatile situation that defied easy resolution. The emergence of Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, from the fragmenting Chagatai territories, represented both continuity and change in Central Asian political development. Timur claimed descent from the imperial family and adopted many of the military and administrative techniques that had made the original conquests possible. Yet his empire was fundamentally different from its predecessor, more explicitly Islamic in character, more focused on traditional conquest and plunder, and less committed to the systematic governance that had characterized the mature imperial period. Timur's conquests, while spectacular, demonstrated the impossibility of recreating the conditions that had made the original empire possible. His armies could defeat any opponents they encountered, and his administrative skills allowed him to govern vast territories effectively. But the world had changed fundamentally since the 13th century. The targets of conquest had learned from their previous defeats and developed more effective methods of resistance, while the economic and technological advantages that had once favored nomadic forces had largely disappeared. The Ilkhanate in Persia experienced a different pattern of decline, though one that was equally fatal to imperial unity. The conversion of the ruling elite to Islam had initially strengthened their position by reducing religious tensions with their subjects, but it also created new conflicts with the broader imperial system, which remained officially committed to religious tolerance and nomadic traditions. Economic problems in the Ilkhanate were particularly severe because the region's prosperity depended heavily on long-distance trade that required political stability across vast territories. As imperial unity weakened, the trade routes that had sustained Persian cities became increasingly dangerous and unreliable. Merchants shifted their activities to maritime routes that bypassed the traditional overland paths, reducing the revenues available to regional authorities. The fragmentation of the Ilkhanate into competing successor states reflected the broader pattern of imperial dissolution. Local governors and military commanders, recognizing that central authority could no longer provide effective support, began establishing independent power bases. These successor states often adopted the administrative techniques and cultural policies of the imperial period, but they lacked the resources and territorial scope necessary to maintain the standards of governance that had characterized the mature empire. The Black Death, which reached the former imperial territories in the 1340s, delivered a devastating blow to populations that were already weakened by political instability and economic decline. The disease spread rapidly along the trade routes that had once been the empire's greatest strength, demonstrating how completely the political fragmentation had disrupted the public health measures that effective governance required. The Golden Horde in Eastern Europe faced unique challenges related to its position on the frontier between nomadic and settled civilizations. The Horde had never fully committed to either lifestyle, maintaining nomadic military traditions while also governing settled agricultural populations. This hybrid approach had been successful during the period of imperial expansion, but it became problematic as external pressures mounted and internal conflicts intensified. The rise of Muscovy represented the most serious long-term threat to the Golden Horde's position. The Russian principalities had initially been devastated by the original conquests, but they had gradually rebuilt their strength while adapting many of the administrative and military techniques they had learned from their conquerors. By the 14th century, Moscow was emerging as a regional power capable of challenging nomadic authority. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380 marked a psychological turning point in the relationship between the Golden Horde and its Russian subjects. While the nomadic forces ultimately recovered from this defeat and reasserted their authority temporarily, the battle demonstrated that Russian resistance was becoming increasingly effective. The balance of power that had sustained nomadic rule for over a century was shifting decisively in favor of the settled populations. The internal divisions within the Golden Horde accelerated its decline during the 15th century. Competition between different claimants to leadership created civil wars that weakened the state's military effectiveness and administrative capacity. These conflicts were complicated by religious tensions, as Islamic influences from Central Asia competed with traditional shamanic beliefs and Orthodox Christian influences from the subject populations. The final fragmentation of the Golden Horde into the successor Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Crimea reflected the impossibility of maintaining nomadic unity in an increasingly settled world. These smaller states retained some of the military traditions and administrative techniques of their imperial predecessor, but they lacked the resources and territorial scope necessary to resist the expanding Russian state that would eventually absorb most of their territories. Environmental factors played a crucial role in the empire's decline, though their importance has often been underestimated by historians focused on political and military developments. The Little Ice Age, which began in the 13th century, made the steppes increasingly inhospitable to traditional nomadic life. Colder temperatures and changing precipitation patterns reduced the productivity of grasslands that had sustained the pastoral economy for millennia. These environmental changes forced nomadic populations to rely more heavily on agricultural production and settled trade, reducing their mobility and military effectiveness. The adaptation to these new conditions required fundamental changes in social organization and economic practices that many nomadic communities were unable or unwilling to make. The result was a gradual weakening of the nomadic way of life that had been the foundation of imperial power. The demographic consequences of the imperial period also contributed to long-term decline. The massive population losses caused by the original conquests had never been fully recovered in many regions. Subsequent conflicts, natural disasters, and disease outbreaks further reduced populations that were already struggling to maintain the economic productivity necessary for effective governance. The disruption of traditional agricultural and commercial systems during the conquest period had created dependencies on imperial administration that became problematic as central authority weakened. Regions that had once been economically self-sufficient found themselves unable to maintain prosperity without the imperial infrastructure that had supported their development. The legacy of the empire's administrative innovations became a double-edged sword during the period of decline. The sophisticated governmental systems that had once been strengths became burdens when they could no longer be supported by adequate resources. The costs of maintaining elaborate bureaucracies and military establishments exceeded the diminished revenues available to the successor states, creating fiscal crises that accelerated political fragmentation. By 1400, the unified empire that had once dominated Eurasia existed only in memory and in the claims of various successor states. The Yuan remnants in the steppes, the Timurid Empire in Central Asia, the successor states of the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the fragmenting Golden Horde in Eastern Europe all claimed the imperial legacy, but none possessed the resources or capabilities necessary to recreate the unified system that had characterized the empire's peak. The transformation was so complete that later generations would struggle to understand how the scattered nomadic tribes they encountered could be descendants of the forces that had once conquered half the known world. The empire had become a legend, its achievements so extraordinary that they seemed almost mythical to those who had not witnessed them directly. Yet the changes it had brought to the world would endure long after its political structure had disappeared, shaping the development of civilizations across Eurasia for centuries to come. The collapse of the unified empire in the 14th century marked the end of a political entity, but it was only the beginning of its influence on world history. The changes wrought by over a century of nomadic rule would reshape civilizations across Eurasia in ways that continue to influence global development today. From military tactics to trade networks, from diplomatic practices to genetic inheritance, the imperial legacy penetrated so deeply into human civilization that it became impossible to separate from the broader course of historical development. The military innovations pioneered during the imperial period fundamentally transformed warfare across the known world. European armies that had survived the invasions of the 1240s retained vivid memories of the tactical superiority they had encountered, leading to systematic adoption of many nomadic techniques. The emphasis on mobility, coordinated maneuvers, and psychological warfare became standard elements of European military doctrine, influencing everything from the organization of cavalry units to the development of artillery tactics. Russian military development was particularly shaped by the imperial experience. The principalities that eventually coalesced into the Russian Empire retained many of the administrative and military innovations they had learned during 2 centuries of nomadic rule. The famous Cossack formations that would later terrorize European battlefields represented a direct adaptation of steppe cavalry techniques to settled military needs. The Russian emphasis on rapid movement across vast territories, flexible command structures, and the integration of diverse ethnic groups into military units all reflected lessons learned during the imperial period. The Ottoman Empire, which emerged in Anatolia during the period of imperial decline, incorporated many techniques and organizational principles derived from nomadic traditions. The Janissary system of military slavery, the emphasis on merit-based advancement within the military hierarchy, and the use of coordinated cavalry and infantry tactics all showed clear influences from the imperial military model. The Ottomans' remarkable success in conquering much of southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean owed much to their synthesis of nomadic military traditions with Islamic administrative practices. Chinese military development took a different direction, largely because the Ming dynasty was explicitly committed to rejecting the nomadic influences that had characterized the Yuan period. Yet even the Ming could not entirely escape the imperial legacy. The tribute system that governed Chinese relations with neighboring peoples incorporated many diplomatic practices that had been developed during the imperial period. The Chinese emphasis on frontier defense, the construction of massive fortification systems, and the development of gunpowder weapons were all responses to the military challenges that nomadic forces had posed. The technological exchanges facilitated by imperial rule had consequences that extended far beyond the empire's political boundaries. Gunpowder, which had been a Chinese invention, spread rapidly westward along the trade routes protected by imperial authority. By the time European forces encountered this technology, it had already been refined through decades of use in siege warfare across Central Asia and the Middle East. The development of artillery and firearms that would revolutionize European warfare was directly descended from innovations that had occurred within the imperial system. Printing technology followed a similar pattern of diffusion. Chinese printing techniques, protected and promoted by imperial authorities, spread across the trade networks that connected Europe with Asia. The mechanical reproduction of texts made possible by printing revolutionized education, religious practice, and administrative record-keeping throughout Eurasia. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution all depended on the rapid dissemination of ideas that printing made possible. Yet this technology might never have reached Europe without the imperial communication networks that facilitated its transmission. The agricultural and technological innovations that had been exchanged across the empire's territories continued to influence regional development long after political unity had disappeared. Crop varieties that had been introduced to new regions during the imperial period became staples of local agricultural systems. The cotton cultivation that had spread from Central Asia to Eastern Europe, the rice varieties that had been adapted to new climatic conditions, and the animal breeds that had been transported across continental distances all represented lasting contributions to human economic development. The monetary and commercial innovations pioneered during the imperial period laid the foundation for later developments in international trade and finance. The concept of paper currency, backed by governmental authority, spread from China across much of Eurasia during the imperial period. Although the specific currency systems established by imperial authorities did not survive the empire's fragmentation, the underlying principles influenced monetary development in successor states across the region. The standardization of weights, measures, and commercial practices that had facilitated trade across the empire's territories created expectations of uniformity that persisted long after political unity had ended. Merchants who had become accustomed to operating under consistent commercial regulations demanded similar standardization from successor governments. The result was a gradual harmonization of commercial practices that facilitated the revival of long-distance trade, even after the collapse of the political structures that had originally protected it. The diplomatic practices developed during the imperial period established precedents that influenced international relations for centuries. The concept of diplomatic immunity, the use of hostage exchanges to guarantee agreements, and the development of permanent diplomatic missions all had roots in imperial administrative practice. The complex negotiations required to govern an empire that included dozens of different peoples and political traditions created diplomatic techniques that were later adopted by European powers as they developed their own international systems. The imperial emphasis on religious tolerance and cultural diversity created models for governing multinational populations that would influence political development across Eurasia. The Ottoman millet system, which allowed different religious communities to maintain their own laws and customs within the broader imperial framework, showed clear influences from nomadic administrative practices. The Russian approach to governing diverse ethnic and religious minorities similarly reflected lessons learned during the period of imperial rule. The genetic legacy of the imperial period represents one of the most direct and measurable impacts on human development. Scientific studies have identified genetic markers associated with the imperial ruling family across vast regions of Eurasia, from Central Asia to Eastern Europe. The famous claim that millions of people across these regions may be descended from Genghis Khan reflects the enormous demographic impact of imperial expansion and the intermarriage between nomadic elites and local populations that characterized imperial governance. This genetic legacy extends beyond simple heredity to include cultural and linguistic influences that shaped regional development for centuries. The Turkic languages that spread across Central Asia during the imperial period continued to influence communication and cultural development long after the empire's collapse. The Persian cultural influences that spread through imperial administrative networks similarly shaped artistic and intellectual development across regions that had never previously been in close contact. The revival of the Silk Road during the imperial period created commercial networks and cultural connections that persisted long after imperial protection had ended. The cities that had flourished under imperial patronage retained many of the international connections and commercial relationships that had been established during this period. Samarkand, Bukhara, and other Central Asian centers continued to serve as focal points for transcontinental trade and cultural exchange, even as the political structures that had originally supported their development disappeared. The imperial emphasis on scholarship and learning created institutional legacies that influenced educational development across Eurasia. The libraries and academies established under imperial patronage preserved texts and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the political upheavals that followed the empire's collapse. The translation projects that had made knowledge available across linguistic and cultural boundaries established precedents for international scholarly cooperation that would influence the development of universities and learned societies in later periods. The legal innovations developed during the imperial period similarly influenced jurisprudential development across the region. The hybrid legal systems that had combined elements from different legal traditions established precedents for governing diverse populations under unified legal frameworks. These innovations influenced the development of legal systems in successor states and provided models for later attempts to create international legal standards. The environmental impact of the imperial period was equally significant, though often overlooked by historians focused on political and cultural developments. The massive population movements that characterized imperial expansion and administration led to the introduction of new species and agricultural practices across vast territories. The environmental consequences of these changes continued to influence regional ecosystems long after the political structures that had initiated them had disappeared. The demographic recovery that occurred in many regions after the initial devastating period of conquest was facilitated by imperial policies that encouraged population movement and intermarriage. The genetic and cultural diversity that resulted from these policies created populations that were often more resilient and adaptable than their predecessors. This demographic legacy contributed to the rapid recovery and expansion that characterized many regions in the centuries following imperial collapse. The urban planning and architectural innovations that had been developed during the imperial period influenced city development across Eurasia for centuries. The planned capitals like Karakorum and Khanbalik established models for urban design that integrated different cultural traditions and functional requirements. These models influenced the development of cities from Moscow to Istanbul, as rulers sought to create urban centers that could serve as focal points for diverse populations and international connections. The artistic and cultural synthesis that had characterized the imperial period created new forms of expression that combined elements from different traditions. The architectural styles, decorative motifs, and artistic techniques that had been developed through imperial patronage continued to influence cultural development long after the political structures that had supported them had disappeared. The Islamic architectural traditions of Central Asia, the decorative arts of Persia, and the court cultures of various successor states all showed clear influences from the imperial period. In the modern era, the imperial legacy has taken on new significance as nations across the former imperial territories have sought to understand their historical development and cultural identity. Mongolia has embraced Genghis Khan as a national symbol, celebrating the imperial achievements while sometimes minimizing the more destructive aspects of imperial expansion. China has similarly incorporated the Yuan dynasty into its historical narrative, though with emphasis on the ultimate triumph of Chinese civilization over foreign rule. Russia's relationship with the imperial legacy is more complex, reflecting the country's position as both a victim and a beneficiary of imperial expansion. The administrative techniques, military traditions, and territorial scope that characterized the Russian Empire all showed clear influences from the period of nomadic rule. Yet Russian national identity has often emphasized resistance to rather than accommodation with nomadic influences. The scholarly reassessment of the imperial period that has occurred in recent decades has revealed the extent to which previous historical accounts had been shaped by the perspectives of settled civilizations that viewed nomadic expansion primarily as a destructive force. Modern historians have recognized that the empire represented one of the most successful experiments in cross-cultural governance and international integration in human history, anticipating by centuries many of the challenges and opportunities that characterize modern globalization. The imperial achievement in creating the first truly global communication and transportation network has particular relevance for understanding modern developments in international commerce and cultural exchange. The challenges of governing diverse populations across vast territories, managing complex economic relationships, and maintaining political unity while accommodating cultural diversity are all issues that contemporary international organizations continue to address. The empire's approach to religious and cultural tolerance provides important lessons for modern, multicultural societies struggling to balance unity with diversity. The imperial emphasis on pragmatic accommodation, merit-based advancement, and institutional flexibility offers alternative models to both rigid assimilation and complete fragmentation that remain relevant for contemporary policymakers. Perhaps most significantly, the imperial period demonstrated the possibility of creating political and economic systems that transcended traditional boundaries of ethnicity, religion, and culture. While the specific institutional forms developed during this period were ultimately unable to survive the challenges they faced, the underlying principles of inclusion, adaptation, and systematic organization continue to influence efforts to create more effective and equitable forms of governance. The story of the empire thus represents more than just a remarkable episode in medieval history. It provides insight into the possibilities and limitations of human political organization, the dynamics of cultural exchange and adaptation, and the long-term consequences of decisions made by political leaders. In an era when the world faces challenges that can only be addressed through international cooperation and cross-cultural understanding, the imperial legacy offers both inspiration and cautionary lessons about the complexities of governing diverse populations in an interconnected world. In the winter of 1241, advanced reconnaissance units of the imperial army were probing the defences of Vienna, while the main force consolidated its position in Hungary. European resistance had crumbled with stunning speed. Poland had fallen, Hungary was occupied, and the road to Western Europe lay open. Then came word that would change the course of world history. Ogedei Khan was dead. The greatest military machine ever assembled turned east, abandoning conquest for the succession struggles that would determine the empire's future. But what if that messenger had never arrived? What if the iron discipline that had carried nomadic armies from the Pacific to the Danube had continued its inexorable march toward the Atlantic? The Europe that lay before the imperial forces in 1241 was a fragmented continent of competing kingdoms, primitive military technology, and fractured political authority. The Holy Roman Empire was paralyzed by conflict between emperor and pope. France was still recovering from decades of civil war. England was an island kingdom focused on domestic concerns. No European power possessed the organizational capabilities, military technology, or strategic vision necessary to coordinate effective resistance against an enemy that had already demonstrated its ability to annihilate any force that dared oppose it. The conquest of Western Europe would likely have followed the same pattern that had characterized imperial expansion elsewhere. Initial resistance would have been crushed with terrifying efficiency, followed by the systematic incorporation of surviving populations into the imperial administrative system. European knights, accustomed to fighting other heavily armored cavalry, would have proved as helpless against nomadic tactics as their Polish and Hungarian counterparts had already demonstrated. The castle-based defensive systems that dominated European warfare would have been irrelevant against armies that could simply bypass fortifications and ravage the countryside until garrisons surrendered. Within a decade, imperial administrators would have been cataloguing European populations, implementing taxation systems, and establishing the communication networks that had enabled effective governance across the empire's other territories. European craftsmen would have been incorporated into imperial workshops, their skills combined with techniques derived from Chinese, Persian, and other traditions. European scholars would have gained access to the accumulated knowledge of Asian civilizations, potentially accelerating intellectual development by centuries. The religious implications would have been profound. The imperial policy of religious tolerance would have fundamentally altered the development of Christianity in Europe. The rigid orthodoxy that characterized medieval European Christianity would have been impossible to maintain in an environment where Islamic scholars, Buddhist monks, and Confucian administrators all enjoyed imperial protection. The Crusades, which had defined European relations with the Islamic world for centuries, would never have occurred. The religious wars that would devastate Europe in later centuries might have been prevented by the imperial emphasis on accommodation rather than conversion. The economic transformation would have been equally dramatic. European participation in the imperial trade networks would have connected the continent to Asian markets centuries earlier than actually occurred. The commercial revolution, the age of exploration, and the development of global trade networks would have followed completely different patterns if Europe had been integrated into existing Asian commercial systems rather than developing its own competing networks. The scientific and technological development that would eventually give Europe global dominance might never have occurred. The competitive pressures that drove European innovation, the need to develop new military technologies, navigation techniques, and industrial processes to compete with Asian civilizations, would have been unnecessary if Europe had been part of a unified Eurasian system. The scientific revolution and the industrial revolution might have taken place in different locations and followed different trajectories. The age of exploration would certainly have been unnecessary. European maritime expeditions to Asia were driven by the desire to bypass Islamic intermediaries and establish direct trade relationships. If Europe had been connected to Asian markets through overland routes protected by imperial authority, there would have been no incentive to develop the naval technologies and navigation techniques that enabled global maritime expansion. The colonization of the Americas would have followed a completely different pattern if it occurred at all. The diseases that devastated Native American populations were largely introduced by European contact. If imperial forces had reached the Americas first, the demographic catastrophe that characterized European colonization might have been avoided through the more systematic approach to population management that characterized imperial administration elsewhere. The political development of the modern world would have been fundamentally different. The European state system that emerged from the ruins of the Roman Empire and dominated global politics for centuries would never have developed. The concepts of sovereignty, nationalism, and competitive international relations that shaped modern political thought were products of European historical experience that would have been irrelevant in a unified Eurasian system. Yet this alternative history also suggests that the very factors that made imperial expansion possible would have made its continuation increasingly difficult. The environmental and logistical challenges that ultimately contributed to imperial fragmentation would have been magnified by expansion into regions even more distant from the steppes. The cultural and religious diversity that would have characterized a Europe including empire would have strained the administrative systems that had already proven barely adequate for governing existing territories. The question of whether human civilization would have developed more or less successfully under continued imperial rule remains unanswerable. The empire's achievements in promoting trade, cultural exchange, and technological innovation were remarkable, but so were the innovations that emerged from the competitive European state system that actually developed. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution were products of the specific historical circumstances that characterized post-imperial Europe. Perhaps the most profound implication of this alternative history is what it reveals about the contingent nature of historical development. The world we inhabit today, dominated by European-derived political concepts, economic systems, and cultural values, was not the inevitable result of superior European civilization. It was the product of specific historical circumstances, including the decision of imperial commanders to abandon their western campaigns in 1241. A single messenger's journey from Karakorum to Hungary shaped the development of global civilization in ways that continue to influence human development today. The story of what might have been thus illuminates the significance of what actually occurred. The empire's ultimate failure to achieve permanent global unification allowed for the development of the diverse, competitive, and ultimately innovative global system that characterizes the modern world. Yet the imperial vision of a unified human civilization, governed by principles of tolerance, merit, and systematic organization, remains relevant as humanity faces challenges that can only be addressed through unprecedented levels of international cooperation. In that sense, the empire's greatest legacy may not be what it accomplished, but what it demonstrated about the possibilities and limitations of human political organization.